Hello and welcome to the very first episode of the Brussels Signal podcast. It is my very great pleasure to announce that we want Batya Ungar-Sargon as our first guest. Ms. Sargon is a columnist for Compact magazine. She's the deputy opinion editor for Newsweek and a regular commentator on American and international media. In our conversation, we talk about the appeal of Donald Trump, what makes the working class, what it means for the future of democracy, anti-Semitism in the West, and what's going on college campuses. Without any further ado, let's check out the conversation. Well, it is my great pleasure today in our very first podcast for the Brussels Signal to welcome Batya Ungar-Sargon. And it was with a very specific reason why we picked her as our first guest, which is, if I remember correctly, your first book came out 3 years ago. I think it was in October 2021. Mm-hmm. And I think in April of this year, the new book is going to come out. And I really want to tie the themes a little bit together, beginning with your first book, kind of have a little bit of a preview in the upcoming book and everything that happened in between. Now, if you would, for our viewers and listeners, recap a little bit the main thesis of your first book, Bad News, what it is about, and particularly over the last 3 years, do you feel vindicated or would you say and write things differently?
So first of all, thank you so much for having me, Ralph. I'm so deeply honored to be part of your inaugural podcast. I have to admit to your listeners, I do hate you a little bit because you're smarter than me, better educated, better spoken, and better looking, and we're in the same space and making the same arguments. So I feel a little bit like I don't stand a chance.
Fake news from the beginning.
But anyway, your listeners are in for a raucous, wild ride in which they're going to learn so much and particularly learn how to see through so much of the elite garbage that we get crammed down our throats, which they like to pass off as some sort of moral high ground, when the truth that you and I are constantly pointing out is it's nothing more than class warfare against the working class. So that was actually what Bad News was about. I wrote my first book, Bad News, How Woke Media is Undermining Democracy, during the lockdown, the COVID lockdown, and it came out, as you said, in October of 2021. And the argument that I made in that book is that our media looks like it is very politically divided between conservatives and liberals, or Republicans and Democrats. But what I argued in the book is that what looks like a political divide is actually a class divide between an over-credentialed college elite and the working class. And what happened was there was a great realignment in the United States to where 50, 60 years ago, the Democrats represented labor and the working class, and the Republicans were the party of the rich. And today you've really seen a reversal. The Democrats are the party of the over-credentialed, highly educated elites and the dependent poor. And then you have Republicans who the vast majority of their voters are working class. And of course, this speaks to the rise of Donald Trump, just like the Brexit. All of these things are reflections of this class divide, which has come to really define Western society in the 21st century. And what I argue in my book is that the reason that our media is so liberal, so leftist, so woke, is that it's actually, perpetrating class warfare against the working class. Wokeness is a smokescreen for class. So this ideology that they bring out of the universities with them, that, the number one division and defining feature of American life is race, and that America is a deeply racist society in which they view the entire world as divided between powerful and powerless, and then they superimpose race onto that. This woke worldview, to them, they think that this is some sort of virtue, and the truth is it's just a way of hiding how the liberal and leftist elites have benefited from inequality in the United States, and how they have hoarded not only massive amounts of political power, not only massive amounts of GDP, but actually the American dream itself, which is increasingly only available if you have a college degree. And so they use all of these other things, race, gender, trans, all of this stuff to mask the ways in which they have actually benefited and left the working class behind to struggle with deaths of despair, with, suicide, drug overdose, worse health outcomes, and of course, this struggle to achieve the American dream. So that's kind of the argument that I made in Bad News.
Would you think that Karl Marx once said that the working class suffers from false consciousness, right? So they don't know that they're the working class, and this is why they can't really start the revolution. Do you think, if I take your description, that many of the issues that kind of are summarized under the label woke are part of a class war more than a culture war? But do you think that in a sense it has also bled down into the working class, so that even they have in some areas subscribed to the culture wars, even though it's something that might just be a symptom of a broader class-related struggle?
I really hate that argument. I mean, I call myself a Marxist, by which I mean, like, I think class is at the root of everything, but I increasingly call myself a Trump Marxist, because I think Trump was a Marxist by that definition. He really, his entire economic agenda was about making the working class feel seen and heard and putting money in their pockets, which is what they'll tell you. To me, the American working class is just, I'm a populist, so I can't help but see, first of all, how deeply tolerant they are. This is something that neither party wants to admit, but when you talk to Trump voters, to the average liberal, Trump looks like an extremist. But to the average Trump voter, he's a liberal, and they like that about him. He's moderate on abortion. He's liberal on gay marriage and gay issues, which they really like about him. And of course, he's very protectionist economically. He managed to tap into something that the working class is deeply savvy about, that neither party understands at all, which is that the economy that works for them is protectionist. It's not leftist or liberal, and it's not libertarian or conservative. And so what you had before Trump was the Democrats pushing for what is a liberal economic version in the American sense, meaning expanded welfare, even universal basic income. Now they're floating this idea, open free trade. So you get cheap products from China, build up China's middle class, right? Offshoring of manufacturing. But what you have is basically you expand the welfare to compensate for the fact that the economy that the Democrats want to build no longer really has a place for a strong working class. I mean, it was Clinton who started NAFTA and started all of this offshoring of manufacturing, right? That he was a Democrat, right? So this sort of free trade, expanded welfare, and then you have this college-educated top quintile, top 10% who's making, a combined income of $500,000 a year and has the American dream, right? And everybody else is living in public housing, right? That's the liberal version. Working class people hate that because whether they're Democrats or Republicans, they know people who are scamming the system, who have chosen to live off of welfare, off of their hard work and their taxpayer dollars. And honestly, the system is set up to reward that and to penalize people who work really hard. So that's the liberal model. On the other hand, you had the Republican model, which was tax cut, tax cut, tax cut. That's the only thing that the Republican donor class really cares about is tax cuts. It was pro-corporation. It was also pro-free trade, handshake agreement between the two parties. For a long time, the Republicans were the party of immigration and amnesty because, hey, they love slave labor, right? So that was their model. And of course, the working class hates that too, because they are the working class, right? Their interests are always going to be fundamentally at odds with those of corporations, with the rich who employ them, with illegal immigrants who drive down their wages, right? So those were the two parties. You had the party of the rich and the poor, which is the Democrats, and then the party of just the rich, which was the Republicans. And Trump showed up and he realized instinctively that NAFTA was bleeding the people who were voting for him dry, that immigration was a huge problem for them, that, trade, the free trade that we had established had given China, our greatest enemy, a huge leg up over us. He understood that a working class agenda was protectionist, that you had to protect the labor of hard-working Americans who work with their hands. This is something that is so brilliant, but also so obvious, but had eluded both parties because they were both catering to their elites. The thing is, the working class knew this all along. Like the idea, this whole Thomas Frank thing, what's the matter with Kansas? That they had gotten duped into voting for Republicans because of cultural issues and abandoned their economic interests over this stuff. It's such nonsense. I mean, I've never met smarter people about economics than working class people. They and if you ask them why they vote for Trump, they'll list off economic policies, which is why when he comes out and says, I'm going to impose a 10% tariff on every import into the United States, the entire expert class of both sides, no, how could you? This will tank the economy. It will tank the economy for them. But who loves that stuff is working class people. So it's true that they are more conservative socially. The thing that sort of characterizes them is both a kind of innate conservatism, but also an extreme tolerance. There's a practicality to the working class view of life. So, for example, people will tell you, I'm against abortion. I would never get one, but I don't want it to be banned because I wouldn't judge somebody else for doing that. Christians will tell you that, They're anti-trans, but they're very pro-gay. They want a total moratorium on immigration, but they want, universal health care. This is how working class people think. They're very smart and very savvy about what would help them, and they don't understand why both parties are waging war against them.
Do you think if we look at Europe and a little bit also with Bernie Sanders in the United States, it seems that what you just described, that the political right has been more successful in capitalizing on these trends and particularly the sentiment within the working class? Do you think that a left-wing party that would maintain its left-leaning policies but also shift, for example, on migration to the right and kind of make a stronger case that the economy needs to work for the country before it can has any kind of, universalist goals, that could revive the left? Because it's not as bad in the United States, but in continental Europe, social democracy is basically dying. We saw the same in Great Britain now. So you see it basically all over the place. And the second question attached to this is, do you think another reason why people like Donald Trump or Nigel Farage or Geert Wilders, that they have appealed because even though they don't look like, I guess, how somebody would imagine a working class member, but they're authentic? So that you'd rather trust a New York real estate billionaire that is authentic than somebody who plays a working class guy every 4 years. I mean, the worst in the United States, I think, was always John Kasich, who was, I think, always then running around and saying, my father was a postman from Ohio. And and then when they go to Idaho or so, and then they take off their jacket and roll up their sleeves and they pretend to be something that they are not. And they do the same, of course, in Europe as well. So the people say, I'd rather take the guy with the golden toilet who speaks in the same way and makes the same arguments 365 than the other guy who plays to be somebody. And people know if they are being fooled. At least most of them do.
Trump is only an aesthetic proposition or, a character proposition to people who can afford to see him that way. So judging his character or his aesthetics, which is basically all the liberal media does anymore, is something that if you're making less than $125,000 a year, $150,000 a year, you just simply cannot afford to do that. To the working class who see in him a champion, he is the man who controlled the border. It's really that simple, which gets to your first question, which is definitely, if the Democrats woke up and said, actually, we're going to be the side that is going to police this border and protect labor, they would immediately get a lot of support, because the two biggest issues, I think, for working class people are immigration and healthcare. And they've got half of the puzzle, right? And the Republicans will never talk about healthcare, right? So 100%, but they'll never do it, Ralph. And the reason they'll never do it is because their base is the college-educated elite, who is the consumer of low-wage illegal labor, right? Their base benefits very, very much in a real financial way from the open border, because all of the labor that they consume of the working class, and they have to consume working class labor to survive because they sit at home and make podcasts all day. So as the consumers of that labor, the open border has literally put money in their pockets, which is, again, I think actually why you're seeing a difference between the US and Europe, which is that college-educated Americans in I'm sorry, but ridiculous jobs like ours make a lot of money here. And so why would they have no incentive to turn on the kind of liberal democracy. In fact, they're the ones pushing for higher taxes, which of course is an admission of the guilt that they feel about how much more money they make than the people they employ to clean their homes or work in their restaurants or do their landscaping or watch their children. So I think, to me, there is a real understanding of this at some level. But the idea of judging Trump based on his characteristics, his tweets, his rhetoric, it's really a luxury to be able to do that unfortunately most working class Americans really, really don't have right now.
But doesn't it kind of make the average American, and also in Europe, I would say, the average supporter of some of the new populist parties smarter than the representatives, or at least the leading voices in the media? Because, as you say, they look at these candidates and say, ooh, the way they talk and some of the issues, how they approach them. And the average person, or many of them, look at them and say, okay, this is like my bathroom, the bathtub is clogged and I need somebody to clean it out. So I'm going to take the best plumber I can find, not the one that looks the best or that has the nicest outfit, which kind of is probably a much better approach to politics. Is to say the idea of politics is to, define trade-offs, suggest potential solutions, and then let people vote on it, but not have this, as you just described it, this kind of a competition of who is more aesthetic, if you want. So in a sense, it seems that the people are much smarter than they get credit for in the usual reporting.
100%. And it's funny because on the other side of things, you have the liberal elites who pretend that they are voting on things like values and aesthetics. And to a certain degree, that's true. But that aesthetic is hiding a very real economic proposition that is benefiting them in a very real way. So both sides are voting on their economic interests, but one is sneering at the other side for doing so because their economic interests are in tension with them. Unfortunately, the sneerers are the ones who they have a lock on the media, that's for sure. And until Donald Trump, they had a real lock on politics, the elites on both sides. And I have to tell you, even before I could see the benefit that Trump had done for working class people, both psychologically and economically, I was forced to admit that there is something incredible about the fact that he was able to win when so much of American institutional life was committed to stopping that. And you can see now in the primary that's going on, his opponents are outspending him by millions and millions and millions of dollars, Ralph. And all we see is the triumph of American democracy and the electorate having its will, no matter how much money is getting pumped into this election. And I just love that. It makes me feel so hopeful and so empowered and so great about this country.
I mean, I have to kind of follow up on this a little bit, because what you just said, I find it so remarkable, and this is again a similarity we see in Europe and the United States, is so often I feel, and I'm so curious to hear your take on this, that many of the things that are presented to us as being a threat to democracy seem to me to be a very, very strong life sign of democracy, right? That we probably overestimate sometimes the influence or power of media. People are not that, again, they're not that stupid. It's not that they just watch TV all day and they cannot formulate a thought on their own. And I think what we see now is that they say, okay, if those in power are no longer capable of delivering what we expect from them, we're going to look for alternatives. And now you see all these alternatives popping up around the place. And what bothers me so much is, and we see this again in Europe as well, the sheer thought of that somebody new could have a shot at power is immediately represented as a threat to democracy, the end of democracy. And we need to protect democracy ideally by banning parties, getting people off ballots, suppressing information and video clips and whatever from X to YouTube to all these platforms. And I wonder, who is the true threat to democracy? These new movements or those who supposedly protect democracy?
Yeah, I mean, it's not going to surprise you that I think it's the latter. This is what happens when you go to an elite university the number one thing you learn there. I mean, they're not institutions of learning anymore. What they do teach you is to have utter contempt for people who don't have that education. It's a status producing machine. And status, of course, involves seeing yourself as divorced from the average, right? To be part of the elite, you have to stress the sort of vast gap between you and the like lame, normie middle class, right? That is the ethos of our media right now. That is the ethos of basically all of the, not every journalist, there's still, I don't know, 3% who don't have a college degree, but the vast majority have a college degree. The majority have an elite college degree, and the majority have a graduate degree, right? So, think about who gets a graduate degree, not necessarily in journalism, but in some humanities, where the overarching heuristic right now is critical race theory, right? Which is another way of talking about just how awful and lame the middle class is. And so in their attempt to distance themselves from the middle class, they have to constantly come up with ways of showing how they don't have those values because they're better, when of course we know that they're using these allegedly better views to wage war on the working class and the middle class in America. So what they do is they come out of these universities truly believing that anybody who does not agree with them is evil and bad and worthy of like intense contempt. And anything you can do to silence them is worth it. In their mind, or in their words, they'll say, to protect democracy, when the truth is what they're protecting is their own interests, and they're doing a very good job of it. The problem is they really believe this. Like, they're not cynical. They really, really believe it, that they are protecting democracy by doing the most anti-democratic things you can do, like kicking off the most popular politician in America off of a ballot. Like, they truly cannot see how anti-democratic that is, because they don't actually fundamentally believe in democracy. They believe in a kind of oligarchy of the credentialed, let's say. This is sort of the view Obama brought into the White House with him, which is that everyone around you has to have, a Harvard degree or a Princeton degree or a Yale degree. And that's how you know that they're better and they're smarter, and therefore they should be given rule over the majority. And I think the last 20 years have really demonstrated just how little virtue, but also intelligence there is in the expert class. Trump really took an axe to that, whether it was the economics, expert class, the foreign policy expert class. My God, I mean, he just showed that everything they believed about China, about Russia, about the Middle East was like utter nonsense. We really are seeing sort of the death of trust in expertise. And instead of doing any soul searching about the role that they've played in it, the experts will sit there and be like, the terrible American electorate who no longer trusts us, after the mess they made of COVID, after the mess they made of the economy, after everything they do to service their own interests, what they really expect is for the American electorate to follow along and simply co-sign their own descent into deaths of despair. And short of that, the expert class will not be happy.
But that is odd, right? What you just described, because you also mentioned international politics and foreign relations. If you look at the last 3.5 years, and I think almost everybody was willing to give Joe Biden and Kamala Harris the benefit of the doubt once they went into office. But it's very hard nowadays to say that they did a job in even the continuation of the stability that was created during the Trump administration, particularly on foreign policy, which of course leads me to another issue that I think we definitely have to touch upon, because this has been something that was so relevant in the realm of university culture as well. What is going on with this new form, whether I'm not sure if it's really new or if it's just now surfaced, of anti-Semitism at U.S. college campuses, which really has reared its ugly face on multiple occasions in kind of ways I think that would have been unexpected a couple of years ago, and particularly if we look at the events that triggered it, right? What happened on October 7th in Israel, which one would assume should have triggered more a wave of solidarity, but in many ways it was the exact opposite. So how does that fit into the kind of this general kind of woke class warfare elite theory? I mean, were you surprised by the reaction, or did you expect it?
So there's actually a chapter in Bad News, which recall came out in 2021, like basically describing this whole scenario. So I was not surprised by it. I do have to start by saying, we're the luckiest Jews to ever walk planet Earth. Like Anti-Semitism is rising. It is rampant in the American elites on the left. Unfortunately, it's also on the right in the tiny elites there. But I kind of have very little. I have very little patience for, what's happening a lot now, which is Harvard students saying they're not safe because pro-Palestinians are chanting genocidal chants. The left. There's a deep, deep cowardice in the left. The idea that people are physically endangered by leftists is not serious to me. I love what Senator John Fetterman did the other day. This huge protest came to his house chanting, genocidal chants against Israel. And he stood on his roof and held up a huge Israeli flag. Like, that's the way to respond to this.
But isn't it a little bit worrisome that then, because I fully agree with your assessment in many areas, but that one of the most authentic, trustworthy and reasonable members of the US Senate at the moment is the one person who had a series of strokes? I mean, sometimes it's like out of a dystopian novel, because I fully agree with you, right? I remember, like, at the beginning, we remember during his Senate campaign, he basically needed a screen, when questions were read to him, because he had, which is no fault of his own, right? Because he had a stroke. He was mentally incapacitated, and now he's in many ways the voice of reason within the US Senate.
He's the voice of reason, I would say, on the left, right? There's
yes.
a lot of sort of, support for Israel on the right. Although there's some very worrisome things happening there as well. He had his stroke, but he was also under the influence of a real femme fatale, if I may say that, who's now apparently reportedly left him over his support for Israel. So we got to find him a nice Jewish girl. It's fam, we got to show up for this guy. I think a lot of us feel like maybe we misjudged that man, I don't think there is a small fringe, the squad, who's like very anti-Israel, but even in Congress, it's very, very limited. I'm glad this is all coming out. I'm going to answer your question about where the anti-Semitism came from, but I'm sort of glad to see it because, the whole Claudine Gay episode. So she was the president of Harvard who simply could not bring herself to condemn genocidal chants against Jews in front of Congress. And then it was revealed that she was a serial plagiarist. And there were all these calls for her to resign. I really wanted her not to resign because I wanted Harvard to have to live with the infamy of having hired her in the first place, because to me, she was not an aberration of what our university system has become. She was the apotheosis of it. I mean, all of the humanities is essentially sort of ersatz thinking. What is the difference between the person she plagiarized and her plagiarism? Like, that thing she plagiarized was woke nonsense, right? It was not actual scholarship in the first place. It was a facsimile of thinking. So she made a facsimile of thinking. And I was like, this is literally the perfect person to be Harvard's president. Don't let her go. Because the worst thing that could happen from this moment would be for Jews to be like, we just need to get the elite institutions back to being on our side. No. Our side as American Jews is with the American people, and these institutions they hate America, and that is why they hate Israel. And for us to simply try to get them back to the place where, like, that was not quite as visible, no, that would be a real betrayal of this country that has been so good to us as Jews. We should be standing with the working class. And the reason that these institutions are so anti-Semitic is not actually because they hate Jews. It's because they hate America, because they hate Western values, and because they have a woke ideology. And what is wokeness? Wokeness is when you take a worldview based on right versus wrong, like rape, mass murder, dismembering children, bad. Defending people from these things, good, right? Like the obvious building blocks of Western civilization coming straight from the Torah, right? Like this is kind of like so this is the worldview that we had. That was replaced by the woke worldview, which says there's no such thing as good versus bad. There's only powerful versus powerless. And you take race and you superimpose that onto it. So powerful people are white, they're colonizers, and they're inherently evil. And powerless people are people of color, and they are the colonized and the oppressed, and thus inherently virtuous. And that is the defining paradigm of the left today. And when you take that and you look at Israel, even though Israel is a majority people of color, Jews of color, Arabic Jews descended from, coming from Arabic countries, to them, the Jews are white and thus colonizers and inherently evil, and the Palestinians are people of color and thus inherently virtuous, so they literally cannot not side with Hamas, because in their worldview, which it's their habitus, Ralph, they cannot see outside of it. To them, Hamas has virtue because they have darker skin, because they represent the oppressed in their worldview. So, of course, to them, they're not even being anti-Semitic. They're just deploying this mind virus that they cannot see outside of, which leads them to side with rapists, which lead them to side with mass murderers. And, the thing about it is, to them, a person of color has no agency. Only the white oppressor has agency. And so when someone like, Hamas commits atrocities, what do they do with that? What does the woke leftist do with that? Well, this person has no agency. How could they have done anything bad? Well, clearly the agency had to be the victims, the Jews, right? Because they are the only ones in this scenario, in this binary, who have any agency. So they had to retrofit a crime to justify October 7th so they wouldn't have to blame Palestinians for it, right? That's what you're seeing now. That's why you see in the wake of October 7th, a refusal to reevaluate, oh gosh, maybe we sided with the bad guys. No, it must be that the people that we think are the good guys were justified in what they were doing. And so now they have to accuse Israel of genocide. Now they have to accuse Israel of ethnic cleansing. Now they have to accuse Jews of, supporting this fascist regime, the genocidal regime, because there has to be agency here when something so horrific happens, but they cannot accept that it belongs to the perpetrators. So they have to ascribe it to the victims.
Do you think that this is also a little bit of form of narcissistic projection? And what I mean by this is, so you divide the world in this binary of oppressor and oppressed, and it would be morally virtuous to side with those who are being oppressed. But at the same time, once you do this, it seems to me very often it absolves people from knowing anything about the conflict in detail or about those who are actually involved. To give you two examples, and I think that dovetails nicely with what you said. In the United States, for example, I always love these debates about whether during elections you should have voter ID. And then the argument is you cannot demand voter ID because black people and people of color don't know how to get ID and they don't know how to use the internet, which is the most racist thing that you can say. Yeah. And I think, I forgot his name, but somebody was basically doing a poll, and most African Americans have ID. They know how to use the internet because they are not stupid. This is the argument that comes very often from the college-educated white left. And I think in the Israel-Palestine conflict, in a similar way, is you saw, and people made a lot of fun about this, but I think it does point towards something deeper. When you have, for example, movements like, Queers for Palestine. Well, I think, okay, obviously Hamas and the LGBTQ movement don't share much in common, but it almost doesn't matter to them. It's you side with those who are perceived as being the oppressed, thereby you look good. And the conflict is kind of just the backdrop against which you project your own goodness, which is, for lack of a better term, which strikes me as a very, on the one hand, narcissistic worldview, but on the other hand, which I think is underlying the problems with multiculturalism more general, is it absolves you from knowing anything about other cultures, because at the end of the day, it's about you and not really what you're talking about.
I think that's totally right. And I'll go one step further. Because it is about them, they don't actually want to win. They want to lose, which is why their methods of protesting on behalf of the Palestinians are so atrocious. Ruining Christmas and Christmas celebrations, blocking the road to the airport where working class people are trying to get on flights, or driving people to flights, right? Everything they do makes people hate the cause because they don't want to win. They don't want to convince people. They don't want to win hearts and minds. They want the right to feel morally superior to other people. I mean, that's the long and the short of it. That's the difference between the progressive left and, the Democratic mainstream, I would say. They don't actually, and as somebody who has extremely close ties to people in the Palestinian community in Gaza and in the West Bank, it's infuriating that instead of pursuing actual, steps towards peace, where the people that I care about deeply would have civil rights for a change, they are making it more and more impossible to achieve. The Palestinian diaspora is the worst thing that has happened to the Palestinian cause, because from the comfort of homes they own in Park Slope, they sit there and they make maximalist claims as opposed to encouraging good leadership and compromise.
One last question I have on this issue, and I don't know if you thought about this, so if you don't have a take on it, that's fine. It just kind of crossed my mind over the last couple of weeks, and when I saw some videos, right, where people were pulling down pictures of the hostages, and it struck me, and maybe this was a wrong impression, I just watched the wrong videos, but it struck me that very often those who did this turned out to be women. So I'm wondering, do you think that if we want to describe wokeness as a kind of mind virus, that it kind of has different appeal across the gender gap, like whether it's more for men or more for women, but it sometimes it strikes me that there is a difference, that this is not a gender neutral ideological phenomenon.
I have thought about that a lot. I mean, on the one hand, because the woke view places men as oppressors, like it's going to be inherently less appealing to them. But on the other hand, it's now sold out women to the trans agenda, right? So what are they still doing here? It could be that women have more appetite for self-flagellation and self-loathing, which I'm totally willing to accept that is the case. I do think that our culture is disastrously at war with masculinity. And that we're reaping the horrible rewards of that in many, many ways. We do know statistically that if you look at universities, so men and women going into universities, women coming out of universities are way more likely to emerge from universities as very liberal as opposed to men. And so we're creating this political divide that's mapping onto a gender divide, which in 10 years, like, people are not going to be able to find people to date because liberals won't date conservatives. So who are these women gonna marry? There's sort of problems coming down the pike there. The denial of the self that's involved in kind of denying sort of gender, sexuality, eros, like everything that came out of the Me Too movement, where we're trying to sort of get past the things that make life worth living. I mean, I feel like that's kind of it's destined to lead to a dead end, simply biologically, but I guess we'll see where it goes.
Batya, I know that your new book is coming out on April 2nd. It's still a little bit under wraps, but what can you, as a final thing for today, what can you share with us? What can we look forward to? And most importantly, will there be another audiobook, just like your last book, read by yourself?
I'm not sure yet if I'm going to be reading the audiobook. There will be an audiobook. What I can tell you is the question I sought to answer was, who is the American working class, and do they still have a fair shot at the American dream? I couldn't think of a more important question. I was told by many people not to write this book, that it's an impossible undertaking, and it was. The book is not as good as it could have been if I had, 10 years to do it. I'm not an academic with, 12 research assistants. I just flew around the country and interviewed working class people in, many, many industries, both genders, of all races, of all religions, to get a sense of who the working class is and how we could improve their lives. And I can preview that what I found was that working class Americans are much less polarized. In fact, they're not polarized at all. Whether they're liberals or conservatives, they share a common set of, policy preferences that neither party represents. They're deeply, deeply tolerant people, practical people. They work extremely hard. They work with people who they disagree with politically. It would never occur to them not to get along with them. And the long and the short of it is, the American dream does still exist for working class Americans, for some working class Americans, but you can do everything right, and it's still a crapshoot. It's a 50-50 crapshoot whether you'll be able to afford to own a home, whether you'll have adequate health care, whether your children will be upwardly mobile. So the conclusion I draw is that we've really broken the contract with the working class, and the first party to realize this is going to have a lot of support, and they're going to have my support. Yeah,
and I think the same applies in Europe as well. Batya Ungar-Sargon, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for this conversation. I'm looking forward to doing this again once the book has come out.
Thank you so much. God bless you.